Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 44 in the book of John. I'm going to title this with a hat nod to Snoopy and Charles Schultz. It was a dark and stormy night. That's how all Snoopy's stories started. And we're in the story of Jesus walking on water. It's the fifth miracle that he's done, at least in the book of John. And we're kind of blasting through some of the miracles. Listen to the story here as it is stated in John. This is John chapter 6. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. Verse 17 now. They got into a boat and started to cross the sea to Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. All right, so a couple of questions, and if you want to get sort of the complete story, there's a little bit more details in Mark 6, and I'll mention just a couple of those. So first of all, we're just leaving the miracle of feeding the 5,000. And that was more like 10 or even 15,000 people. So what happened to that crowd? Well, they were dismissed, and we know that their bellies were full. Maybe their backpacks were full as well with food, but they were dismissed. And why did Jesus need to catch up to the disciples in the boat? Well, he went up to the mountain to pray. So Jesus is getting all prayed up. The disciples cross at least part of the Sea of Galilee. They go from the east side of the Sea of Galilee to the north of the Sea of Galilee, probably maybe an 8-mile trip or something like that, possibly a 10-mile trip. But why was it scary? So here's the thing. It didn't start as a dark and stormy night. It started in the evening, but it wasn't dark. It wasn't windy. They weren't tired. And then all these things kind of happen. So then a storm kicks up. Mark tells us that the storm was actually, the wind was against them, and their way was difficult, that they had to make headway painfully. And they were at the fourth watch of the night, which means that it was at least 3 a.m., somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., but still dark. So they had rowed maybe halfway or something like that, 3 or 4 miles, in at least 6 hours, maybe even a 9-hour trip. So they were kind of, treading water in a rough sea. Now the boats had poor control. The sails were fixed. 500 years from this time was when the movable sail was invented. So they did have a rudder, and they had oars, and they were rowing against this wind. So it becomes night, it becomes dark, it becomes stormy, and this is the context where Jesus starts to walk on water. Mark tells us that he meant to pass them by, which, I don't understand that. They thought that he was a ghost, and they were terrified. So Jesus comes. And so when Jesus comes, when Jesus manifests himself, they're terrified in this situation, which is kind of hilarious. He says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." All right, so he gets into the boat, the wind ceases, they're astounded, and they end up in the place where they want to be. Now, they forgot about the loaves. Mark tells us they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So this is the point, is they forgot about their superpower, which was to associate themselves with the super powerful Jesus. So remember, what they did in the story was they got the math right of how many people and how much food they needed and how much money they had, and they came up short, but they forgot the super powerful Jesus. So they get the math right, but forgot the Lord. And then we find here today is if they did learn a lesson, they forgot it by the time they got into the boat, which is the next thing that happened. So Jesus is the Lord of the loaves, even when he walks on water. So they had the opportunity to place Jesus between this impossible problem and the impossible solution. All right, so how does Jesus identify himself? Well, as if walking on the water wasn't enough, he says ego ami, which is I am. So he goes all Old Testament. He reveals himself as the Old Testament guy. So you remember the story back in Exodus chapter 3 where Moses sees a burning bush. He's on Mount Horeb and he turns aside to this burning bush. And God tells him, I see the affliction of the people in Egypt. I see Pharaoh, and I want you, Moses, to bring them out. And then Moses says, well, what do you want me to call your name? It's in Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. He says, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And then remember a couple of chapters ago at the woman the woman at the well, where he says to her as well that I who speak to you am he. So Jesus is associating himself with this Old Testament revelation of God. It's a very strong revelation of himself. So should they be surprised? No. Psalm 77 says, your way was through the sea, your path was through the great waters, your footprint were unseen. Psalm 107 says, he made the storm be still and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. So the practical question that I want to leave you with is, what should I do with this now? I know you have storms of life. Of course you do. I guess point number one would be, are you all prayed up? Are you ready spiritually? Do you wish to be alone in the storm? So that would be, are you embedding yourself in the people of God, the people that represent him? I think that's a good place to start. And then the question would be, well, have you pushed God away? Are you in disobedience? Are you in rebellion? It's kind of, if you are, you're not alone, because that's the whole story of the Bible. It's a story of rescue and return and restoration and eventually relationship with him. So what kind of people call on God during the storm? We're scared people, wet people, tired people, at their limit, people that cry out, people who are afraid. And who do you call upon the storm? Well, here's the great news. You call upon the I am. He is God. Do he avail himself of Lord, Creator, and Heaven Keeper, and deliverance vehicle? And then also be assured about this. When do we call on him? We call on him when it turns into a dark and stormy night. Thanks for listening.